Welcome to the Korea Society's live webcast. I'm Jo, Senior Director of Arts and Culture. Once considered a dubious cuisine relegated to the ethnic food category, Korean food is now hotter than ever in the United States and beyond. Ingredients like gochugaru and gochujang show up on the menus of American fast food chains and local grocery stores, while Korean cooking shows and mukbang videos have become a genre of their own on streaming platforms and social media. Tonight, Professor Robert Ji-sung-koo will explore the rising popularity, appreciation, and appropriation of Korean food around the world, particularly in the United States, and its relationship to the global proliferation of Korean popular culture, a phenomenon commonly known as hallyu, the Korean wave. Robert Ji-sung-koo is Associate Professor of Asian and Asian American Studies at Binghamton University. He's the author of the book, Dubious Gastronomy, Eating Asian in the USA, and co-editor of Pop Empires, Transnational and Diasporic Flows of India and Korea, and the upcoming book, Future Yet to Come, Socio-Technical Imaginaries in Modern Korea. Professor Koo is not joining us from the 32nd Street in New York. He is joining us from Binghamton, New York. Welcome to the Korea Society's live webcast, Professor Koo. Thank you so much for joining us.
Well, thank you. So I will share my screen and then I'll get started then.
Let me just quickly remind our viewers that they can send the questions via Twitter at Korea Society Art or email artsandculture@koreasociety.org. And Professor Koo, the screen is yours now.
Thank you. Thank you, Jay, and everyone else at the Korea Society for this kind invitation. It's truly an honor to share my work with you all. I get started. Today's presentation is a tiny bite of a longer book project that I'm currently trying to finish up. I had hoped to be done with it by now, but COVID has disrupted my progress, along with most of other things in my life. I'm sure with yours as well. So I'm about a year behind. Tentatively titled Hot, 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 Korean Food in the Age of K-pop. The book project brings together the three areas of research that I've been most deeply involved with over the past decade. I want to begin with a very short clip from this scene from the Korean drama, Let's Eat.
잘 먹겠습니다.
Hot, 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 Korean food in the age of K-pop. So the three areas that I've been involved with is food studies, Korean American and diasporic studies, and popular culture studies. The three hots of the title refer to the multiple meanings of the word that I believe perfectly embodies Korean food today from a transnational and diasporic perspective. Hot meaning spicy, tangy, piquant. Hot meaning sizzling, boiling, scalding. Hot meaning popular, trendy, and cool. And to this, I think I can add a fourth hot meaning sexy, titillating, seductive. And a short 10-second clip, I think, embodied all of those things. Try as I might, I can't think of any other national or ethnic cuisine that embodies at its core all these meanings of the word hot simultaneously. If anyone in the audience can think of a cuisine other than Korean that is currently as hot, 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 please feel free to make a note of it in Twitter or email, as Jay suggested earlier, and maybe we can talk about it later if there's time. Part one, taco trucks in every corner. About 4.5 years ago, I was a nervous wreck. Although I was near certain that Hillary had it in the bag, I knew better than to equate near certainty with inevitability. I knew that no matter how considerable her chances, she could still blow it. Well, in the off chance that any of you haven't heard the news, this guy won. I think the journalist Katie Tur summed it up best when she declared, "Unbelievable." Meanwhile, Hillary, shell-shocked and clueless as usual, is still wondering what happened. If any of you care to recall, it was an ugly contest, as even the most neutral of observers denounced the various positions held by Donald Trump as sexist, homophobic, xenophobic, and racist, and with good reasons. At the center of his message was the Great Wall, not the one in China, but the yet-to-be-built wall with Mexico. In a speech he gave to a large crowd in Phoenix in August 2016, Trump repeated what had become his signature slogan: "We will build a great wall along the southern border, and Mexico will pay for the wall." Taking his cue, the crowd roared back, "Build a wall, build a wall." After the speech, a day after the speech, a Mexican-born founder of a group called Latinos for Trump, such a group exists, appeared on a cable news program to explain why the wall was needed. My culture is very dominant culture. It is imposing and it's causing problems. If you don't do something about it, you're going to have taco trucks on every corner. Reaction to this statement were swift. While most were some variations of the observation that racist ideas do not become less racist just because it comes from the mouth of a non-white person, another sentiment began to dominate the discussion. Yes, how amazing it would be to have taco trucks at every corner. That would indeed make America great again. To the countless numbers of Americans who are partial to tacos, a taco truck parked a corner from their home or work would be indeed a gastronomic godsend. And as a lover of tacos who just happens to be Korean American, I find this idea especially appealing due to a particular culinary trend that has been on the rise in the US in the past decade or so. If there's to be a taco truck in every corner, it is not inconceivable that the purveyor would be Korean American and the tacos would be filled with kimchi and other Korean ingredients, such as bulgogi, kalbi, and gochujang. And here are some examples of kimchi tacos that have existed. For all intents and purposes, the Korean taco truck phenomenon can be said to have originated in Los Angeles with the 2008 inauguration of Roy Choi's Kogi Barbecue. Born in Korea in 1970, Choi moved with his family to the US at the age of 2 and grew up in Southern California among not only Koreans, but Mexicans and other Latinos. The Kogi barbecue menu, tacos, burritos, quesadillas, hot dogs, burgers, loaded with a combination of Korean and Mexican ingredients and flavors, is essentially a story of this Korean Mexican-American fusion. Choi has called it Los Angeles on a plate and his vision of LA in one bite. True to the notion that imitation is the greatest form of flattery, copycat food trucks operated by both Koreans and non-Koreans soon sprung up across the country. Korea Barbecue and Kimchi Taco in New York City, Cilantro Barbecue in Austin, Korean Barbecue Taco Box in Orlando, Koreanos in Houston, Mogo Barbecue in Bay Area, and Tokorian in Washington, D.C. to merely scratch the surface. Korean tacos are not just sold in trucks, of course. The number of brick and mortar establishments that have the item on the menu is not only considerable, but constitutes a nationwide phenomenon. Whether or not Trump's wall ever gets built, it appears that Korean tacos are here to stay. Part two, maybe that should be part two. Maybe that was into part one. Maybe it's part two. Mother said she doesn't like jajangmyeon. Question: what are some of the greatest debut songs of all time in the annals of American and British rock, pop, and rap? For me, the leading contenders are Elvis Presley's That's All Right Mama, the Beatles' Love Me Do, the Sugar Hill Gang's Rapper's Delight, Britney Spears' One Baby One More Time, Beyonce's Crazy in Love, and Lil Nas X's Old Town Road. If asked the same question about K-pop, the songs that immediately rise to the top in my mind include SES's I'm Your Girl, 1997, TVXQ's Hug, 2004, Girls' Generation's Into the New World, 2007, SHINee's Replay, SHINee's back, people, right, this year, 2008, 21's Fire, 2001, BAP's Warrior, XO's Mama, BTS's No More Dreams, 2013, Red Velvet's Happiness, 2014, Twice's Like Ooh-Ah, 2015, Astro's Hide and Seek, 2016, Blackpink's Boombayah, 2016, and aespa's Black Mamba of last year. But if I had to pick just one song that qualifies as the greatest debut song in the history of K-pop, I would have to go with G.O.D's To Mother. First released in 1999, not only the song itself, but also the music video, which features a very young Jang Hak in the leading role. Several people were involved in the group's formation, as well as in the writing and producing of To Mother, including Park Jin-young, aka JYP, seen here on the left, my right, in the recent video for When We Disco, featuring Sunmi, formerly of the idol group Wonder Girls, which debuted in 2007, but now disbanded, which liberated Sunmi, I think, to be a great artist all of a sudden. Wonder Girls was perhaps the most successful group to ever appear under the JYP label until the emergence of the 2015 of the girl group Twice, whose current hit, I Can't Stop Me, I haven't been able to stop listening to since its release this past October.
I know it's not right. I can't stop me, can't stop me.
See what I mean? Sometime after the release of To Mother in 1999, GOD, which by the way stands for Groove Overdose, would retroactively list Tupac Shakur as one of the song's composers, since it was quite obvious that To Mother is basically a rearrangement of Tupac's Life Goes On. The song's lyrics chronicle the economic hardship of a single mother raising her teenage son in the face of poverty. At a pivotal point during the song's narrative, the son complains to his mother that he is sick of eating instant ramen all the time, which prompts her to take money out of her emergency fund to buy him a bowl of jajangmyeon. While happily eating, the son asks his mother why she isn't eating with him. Her answer will go on to become one of the most memorable lines in K-pop history.
너무나 행복했었어. 하지만 어머님은 왠지 드시질 않았어. 어머님은 짜장면이 싫다고 하셨어. 어머님은 짜장면이 싫다고 하셨어. 그렇게 살아.
Mother said she didn't like jajangmyeon. Part 3. What's that smell? Until just recently, Korean food was a minor blip on the radar of American food. On the rare occasions when Korean food was made the news, it was often negative, as the food under the media spotlight was either one of two things: kimchi and its malodor, or dog meat and its inhumaneness. To many Korean Americans who came of age before this past decade, Korean food was a source of deep ambivalence. On the one hand, it was our food, an essential marker of our Koreanness. On the other hand, it was not the sort of food that you wanted to share with non-Koreans due to fear of rejection and ridicule. To go further, Korean food was for many Korean Americans a source of shame. Yes, it could be delicious, and you could not live without it for any stretch of time, but it was so different. It was not like any other so-called ethnic food. Even when compared to Chinese or Japanese, neither of which is without its own vexed history in the US, Korean food somehow seemed more alien. Sure, Chinese had the relatively quotidian wonton soup, and Japanese had miso soup, but Koreans had the feverishly crimson yukgaejang. And while Chinese had the relatively benign lo mein and Japanese had ramen, Koreans had the impossibly inky jajangmyeon. Comparatively speaking, Korean food was fiercer and more audacious. But above all, Korean food was miasmic, odoriferous. Simply put, it stank. To varying degrees, most children of immigrants at some point in their lives experience a love-hate relationship with the food of their national origin. In the previous century, generations of Italian immigrants endured being called garlic eaters, and Germans suffered the indignity of being labeled krauts. Mexican Americans still have to put up with the beaner epithet. One way people of society attempt to separate the in-group from the out-group is by building a conceptual wall between what they interpret as our and their cultures. This has certainly been the case in the US. A shared American ritual among young immigrants has been and continues to be the public rejection of past identities, language, religion, food, and any other cultural expressions that the majority deems un-American. As a prerequisite to joining the new world, the new arrivals are pressured to shed the odor of the old world. And what single cultural element embodies odoriferousness more so than food? This is more easily said than done, of course, as the smells of previous lives tend to resist even the most desperate scrubbing. For Korean Americans, the stink of Korean food seemed impossible to conceal or jettison. Comprised significantly of fermented products, Korean food was simply too overwhelming. This applied not only to the many different varieties of kimchi, but nearly everything else of culinary consequence in Korean cookery: gochujang, doenjang, samjang, ganjang, and so forth. In other words, anything that makes Korean food Korean carries the potential of miasma. As food science has shown, the natural outcome of the presence of lactic acid fermentation is tanginess of flavor and smell. To say that Korean food tastes and smells tangy would be the gastronomic understatement of the century. Part 4, Tombek Akashi. About 8 years ago, I woke up from a coma that I fell into in 1973. To be more precise, the Korean part of me fell into a coma, which I finally woke up from 40 years later. In 1973, when I was 8 years old, my family, rendered penniless due to my father's gambling debts, packed up everything we owned, which was basically the clothes on our backs, and left the city of Incheon, where I was born, for Hawaii. At that moment, as the Korean part of me fell into a deep sleep, my American identity was born. I remember very little of my childhood in Incheon, which coincidentally is also the repeated birthplace of Jajangmyeon, as well as quite possibly jampong, tangshuyuk, and other classic Chinese Korean dishes. What few shards of memory that remain are blurry and blunt at best. But among my earliest and fondest memory of that time involves singing, clapping, and dancing to popular Korean songs of the late 1960s and early 1970s with various members of my family, especially my mother and her younger sisters, my imos. It was not until decades later when I discovered that the up-tempo and ebullient sounds that I first exposed to was trot, or trot in Korean vernacular, that remained the dominant genre of popular music in Korea for several generations until the rise of K-pop in the late 1990s. Not all trot is cheerful and dance-inducing, of course. My mother's favorite singer, Lee Mi-ja, who is among the most revered trot singer of all time, is perhaps best remembered for her melancholy songs about loss, pain, and longing. Although she was known as the Queen of Elegy, it would not be unreasonable to call her the Billie Holiday of Korea. Among the most indelible images that I have of my mother during my childhood in Hawaii is of her quietly singing Lee Mi-ja's songs to herself while taking care of household chores. And again, it was not until decades later that I accidentally came across on YouTube a hauntingly beautiful song that stopped me in my tracks. Although I had not heard it for some 40 years, I instinctively knew it was one of Lee Mi-ja's songs that my mother often sang under her breath. The song was Tombek Akashi, Miss Camellia, recorded by Lee Mi-ja in 1964, which just happens to be the year of my birth. Besides being one of Lee Mi-ja's, here's a little bit of that. Besides being one of Lee Mi-ja's earliest and biggest hits, the song is significant in Korean music history because it is representative of the cultural repression of the Park Chung-hee era. Accused of sounding too much like Japanese enka, the song was banned from the public airwaves in Korea for 20 years. But during the period in which it was banned, thousands of miles away, I was able to listen to the song from my mother's lips while she cooked dinner for her family. Part 5, Eastern Paradise on Kealmoku. Until I left for college into California, dinner at home usually meant Korean food. In addition to working as a hotel maid in Waikiki during the day and as a cook and dishwasher at a strip club at night, my mother had to also look after her 3 children and my father, who worked the red-eye shift as a bartender at the same strip club, a vocation that he picked up while working near an American military base back in Korea. To grow up in Hawaii in the 1970s as a Korean immigrant was to invariably be labeled yobo by the local population. Although I didn't realize it then as a boy, the term yobo was directly linked to the work that many Korean immigrants fell into out of necessity as bartenders, exotic dancers, and hostesses at Korean-owned clubs, bars, and lounges, many of which catered not only to the thousands of US military servicemen who had been previously stationed in Korea, but also increasingly to the local population who came to equate Koreans with seedy drinking establishments. Trying her best to be an ideal wife and mother while working 2 full-time jobs, my overworked mother prepared food that was primarily meant to fill the family's stomachs, not delight their taste buds. It also had to be cheap, fast, and simple to rustle up. If the food turned out to be tasty, well, that was a bonus. One such item that fulfilled all these conditions, filling, cheap, simple, fast, and tasty, for me was Sapporo Ichiban Ramen, which at the time was the best-selling brand of instant ramen in Hawaii, and I suspect the world. Among everything my mother cooked, this was hands down my favorite meal, especially when she spiced it up with gochujang and added an egg. It was not until years later in life that I realized the deeper meaning of instant ramen, which, according to a Fuji Institute survey conducted in the year 2000, was voted by Japanese people as the greatest Japanese invention of the 20th century. It easily beat out karaoke machines, which came in second, and the Sony Walkman, which came in at number 3. And just as I didn't realize Korean trot was intimately connected to Japanese enka, I had no idea that instant ramen my mother cooked for me was not Korean, but rather Japanese. And if you go back far enough, Chinese. Similarly, it wasn't until later in life that I figured out Jajangmyeon's connection to the Chinese diaspora. One consequence of Korea's rapid rise up the economic ladder over the past few decades has been the increased internationalization of Korea, especially the rise of foreign tourism, particularly from China. Today, nearly half of the 14 million foreign visitors to Korea are Chinese. Koreans have met the dramatic increase in the number of tourists from China, which is Korea's biggest trading partner, with a healthy dose of ambivalence. On the one hand, they welcome all the money that the Chinese bring to the country. On the other hand, they resent the growing Chinese presence, going as far as to blame nearly everything that they perceive to be wrong with the current state of Korea, such as the horrendous air pollution, on China. Of course, Korea is not the only country in the world to have scapegoated the Chinese for a whole host of domestic problems. The US, for instance, has had a long history of blaming the country's economic and social ills on the ethnic and racial others, beginning with the Chinese. In fact, one might say that scapegoating the Chinese is as American as baseball, Chevrolet, and General Tso's chicken. And this is not new to Korea either. The Park Chung-hee military rule of the 1960s and 70s, for instance, established policies to specifically curb Chinese business activities and limit land ownership, which compelled the majority of ethnic Chinese Koreans, including those whose families have lived in Korea since the early 1900s, in places such as Incheon's Chinatown, to emigrate to Canada, Taiwan, and other places, including the United States, to form the Chinese Korean diaspora and establish livelihoods that often involve one of the few occupations that was made available to them, running Chinese restaurants, largely for the benefit of the Korean diasporic communities, such as the one in Hawaii, for whom a bowl of jajangmyeon meant maintaining a sense of Koreanness via the power of gastronomic nostalgia. Unlike Jang Hyuk's character in G.O.D's To Mother, I never tired of eating ramen. Although, like him, what brought me the greatest joy was when my father would take me to eat jajangmyeon at the Eastern Paradise Chinese restaurant on Keamoku Street near the Ala Moana Shopping Center in Honolulu. Aside from what I still consider the best jajangmyeon, jampong, and tangsiok I've ever had in my life, what I remember most distinctly about Eastern Paradise are the women who work there. To the customers who were mostly Koreans, like my father, the waitresses and cashiers spoke fluent Korean. To non-Koreans, they spoke English, or in Hawaiian Pidgin rather, but among themselves, they spoke in Chinese. I never got around to asking my father about this linguistic mystery, which I didn't solve until many years later. Part 6, Zero to Hero. When my family first came to the US in the early 1970s, the only way for us to eat kimchi at home was for my mother to make it by hand. In those early days, it was often difficult to procure many of the ingredients to make even the most basic type of kimchi, such as pechu kimchi. Mainstream markets did not sell Napa cabbage, so my mother improvised by using the widely available green cabbage that Americans used to make coleslaw. Gochugaru, the other difficult to obtain ingredient, was shipped to her by her sisters who lived in Korea. Not long after, she began purchasing kimchi in our town's only Korean market, which, in addition to selling Korean grocery items not available in mainstream markets, conveniently rented out the latest Korean dramas recorded onto VHS tapes. My mother would rent these tapes by the trunkload. Today, Korean food, and especially kimchi, is all the rage. Major supermarket chains now carry a number of different brands of factory-made kimchi. Health enthusiasts declare kimchi a miracle food for its probiotic qualities. It has become the new yogurt. And diners of all backgrounds seek out Korean restaurants to devour grilled meats cooked on grilled on tabletops, along with the unlimited free kimchi that comes with it. How did Korean food suddenly become so fashionable and trendy? How did it become so hot? Why is Jonah Jameson, personal chef to Leo DiCaprio, suddenly professing that he wakes up every morning craving kimchi? What is the latest cookbook by Gwyneth Paltrow, her third cookbook, containing a recipe for kimchi fried rice? How did Korean food go from zero to hero within a single generation? In other words, how did kimchi end up in tacos, and how is it possible that so many people love it? The simple answer would be that Korean food tastes good, and it was just a matter of time before everyone discovered it. However, given that virtually all national cuisines have the capacity to taste good, the answer does not address the fundamental question of why now? One possible factor that has contributed to the increased popularity of Korean food in the US has been a cadre of skillful and media-savvy Korean American food personalities. As the person singularly responsible for the launching 1,000 Korean taco trucks, Roy Choi has been briefly touched on. During the same period that the media anointed Choi as the face of Korean food's innovative possibilities in Los Angeles, another Korean American, David Chang, who recently, by the way, won $1 million on Who Wants to Be a Millionaire, occupied a parallel position in New York City. As the mastermind behind Momofuku restaurant chain, which began with Momofuku Noodle Bar in 2006, Chang has been heralded as a culinary genius by nearly every influential food critic in the country. But while Choi and Chang might have garnered the most attention, many other Korean American chefs have gained prominence over the past decade, including, in no particular order, Danny Bowen, June Cha, Judy Ju, Bill Kim, Edward Kim, Hooni Kim, Kirsten Kish, Corey Lee, Ji-yeon Lee, Edward Lee, Seri Yu Park, Rachel Yang, and Sang Yoon. This list is significant for at least two reasons. One, it isn't anywhere near exhaustive. And two, given the extremely masculinist, if not misogynistic environment of the professional kitchen, women make up a significant portion of this list. Of course, luminaries such as Julia Child, Wolfgang Puck, Emeril Lagasse, Ming Tsai, and Thomas Keller were food celebrities long before American media discovered Korean American chefs. But while they did not originate the idea, Korean Americans have increasingly become synonymous with the notion of celebrity chefdom, perhaps more so than any other ethnically identifiable group. And given the fact that 4 Korean Americans were nominated for the James Beard Award in 2015 alone, which did not go unnoticed in both US and Korean media, it appears that this trend will continue into the foreseeable future. To wit, before the 2020 James Beard Awards were canceled due to COVID, there were at least 15 Korean American nominees. Aside from the media spotlight, these highly celebrated chefs share another common feature. Collectively, they are famous for the food they are famous for is not what anyone would call traditional Korean food, aka hanshik. Rather, their food is best characterized as eclectic, experimental, and innovative, which is in keeping with the training of many of them received at prestigious culinary schools, the Ivies of the cooking world, if you will, such as the Culinary Institute of America, the French Culinary Institute, and Le Cordon Bleu. These are not the places you go to study if you want to learn how to master the art of hanshik. Their food also reflects their experiences in working in the kitchens of some of the most celebrated restaurants in the US, such as La Bernardine, Café Beloud, the French Laundry, and Charlie Trotter's. Again, these are not the places to acquire work experience if you want someday to open your own place that specializes in traditional Korean food. Like Roy Choi's signature tacos, their menu items are playfully and purposely fusion, but at a high-end level, a culinary crossroad of the world's diverse cuisine, often with pan-Asian sensibilities. Thus, Even as they played an important role in popularizing the idea of Korean food in the US, it would be a mischaracterization to consider these Korean American chefs as purveyors of hanshik, no matter how authentically Korean looking the plates and spoons are. To be sure, hanshik has received considerable attention over the past several years. To wit, in 2012, LA Weekly published an epic article titled Jonathan Gold's 60 Korean Dishes Every Angelino Should Know, which included restaurant recommendations for all 60 dishes profiled. Not to be outdone, in 2014, Pete Wells of the New York Times published his own epic article about Korean food in the borough of Queens, which detailed 12 restaurants accompanied by 31 high-definition photographs that would make any fan of food porn blush. All the media attention to Korean food had the Food Republic declared that in 2014, Korean food had a ridiculously big year in America. What is worth noting, however, is the vast majority of the 5,000 or so Korean restaurants scattered throughout the country are not run by highly trained professional chefs, but by unheralded cooks, often the moms, dads, aunts, and grandmothers of Korean American families. Or, as is increasingly the case, the job of cooking Korean food have fallen increasingly into the hands of Latino workers, who for decades have been employed by Korean American small businesses in areas with significant Mexican and other Central American labor force. This is the case not only in LA and New York City, but also in Atlanta, Georgia, and Annandale, Virginia, among other cities. The rising celebrity status of Korean American chefs and cooks indicates that Korean might be the latest in a long line of so-called ethnic food in America to finally arrive. But as many Americans discover Korean food for the first time, it is perhaps important to remember that the single biggest consumer has always been and continues to be Korean Americans, which today numbers to about 1.7 million. While restaurants are where non-Koreans most commonly encounter Korean food, for Korean Americans, it is in their homes. The problem my mother faced 3 or 4 decades ago procuring Korean grocery items is now a distant memory, as she now has to drive less than 30 minutes from her home near Atlanta, Georgia, to find a well-stocked Korean market. Part 7, happy but sad. When my Korean self fell into a coma back in the early 70s, the music that I fell asleep to was trot. Not just Imi jazz songs, but of other legendary trot singers like Namjoon and Nauna. 40 years later, I would wake up to the sound of K-pop, or to be more precise, I was woken up by the fantastic blare of K-pop, like a long overdue alarm clock. The year was 2012, which along with 2011 will go down in history as among the greatest years in K-pop. Big Bang's Blue, Shiny Sherlock, Sistar So Cool, FX Electric Shock, 21's I'm the Best, Tiara's Cry Cry, Wonder Girls, Be My Baby, Jung Eun-ji and Song In-guk's All For You, 2PM's Hands Up, Bright Eyed Girls' Sixth Sense, and my favorite artist, IU's Good Day are just the top tip of the iceberg. Imagine how I felt waking up to all this amazing music. Needless to say, I was immensely and hopelessly hooked. If I had to think of one word that best described how K-pop made me feel at this moment, I would have to say happy. But my happiness was soon interrupted by a profound sadness in realizing that for 40 years, I missed out on all things Korean. I was crestfallen by the realization that I had slept through nearly half a century of being Korean. In essence, as a Korean, I was an 8-year-old stuck in the body of a 40-something-year-old. The Korea that I woke up to was not the same Korea that I fell asleep on. In other words, a lot has happened in Korea while I was asleep. So I had to try and recoup what I had lost, which became my single-minded mission and hence my current book project. In real terms, this meant consuming as much K-pop and K-drama as possible and as quickly as possible. The result thus far? Well, the Korean person before you today is basically a teenager stuck in a 50-something-year-old man's body. Part 8, the Korean wave. Recall that some 50 years ago, South Korea was among the poorest places on earth. Even North Korea was considered more prosperous with a more promising future. Today, if by some inexplicable magic or miracle, South Korea ranks as the world's 11th economy. As any Korean would insist, this was no accident. Hard work mixed with blood, sweat, and tears, not to mention a military dictatorship that coddled corrupt family-owned conglomerates and rode roughshod over workers, were essential to the material prosperity that the country now enjoys. Who would have guessed even 30 years ago that Korea would become what it is today? Not only the producer of the fiery hot Samsung Galaxy, I think they fixed that problem, and plastic surgery capital of the world, but home to nearly 50 of the world's top 100 female golfers, some of the most psychologically weird and crazily violent movies made anywhere in the past 20 years, and of course, K-pop. In Binghamton, where I currently live, most of the essential ingredients needed to make a variety of Korean dishes are regularly available at Wegmans Food Market, just a quick 10-minute drive from my home. Along with several different brands of kimchi, gochujang, and other essentials, Wegmans carry a variety of instant ramen, which is consumed in such large quantities by Koreans everywhere that it is considered their second rice. This is where I pick up my weekly supply of Shin Ramen, my favorite brand, along with my favorite brand of shrimp crackers. Both are products of Nongshim, one of South Korea's largest food companies. In fact, Wegmans carries no less than 25 different Nongshim products. Nongshim's growing presence in the US leads us to consider another possible factor that has contributed to the rise of Korean food's popularity, the transnational dimension of national and corporate leverage and power. I began this talk by telling you what a nervous wreck I was leading up to election night back in 2016. For the past 5 years, my nervousness had been taken over by utter misery and despair. Whatever fear I had about the horrors of the impending Trump presidency, the reality had turned out to be far worse. I literally wake up every morning with a knot in my gut still, even though Joe Biden has won easily this recent election. There's no doubt in my mind that this past year's meteoric rise in anti-Asian violence, culminating in the tragic shooting in and near Atlanta, where my family lives, is a direct result of Trump's shameful presidency that has also resulted in hundreds of thousands of needless deaths through COVID. My despair has reached the point where I dread reading or watching the news. I don't want to know what awful thing Trump and his minions are up to next. In practical terms, what this has meant is that I've stopped watching MSNBC. So now that I have tuned out or canceled Joy Reid, Chris Hayes, Rachel Maddow, and Lawrence O'Donnell, which translates to 4 hours a night and 20 hours a week, you might wonder what I've been doing all this spare time that I have. Why, doubling down on my dose of Korean popular culture, of course. In addition to the hours and hours of additional time spent watching K-pop music videos on YouTube, I subscribe to 3 online sites that stream an endless procession of Korean programming: Viki, On Demand Korea, and yes, Netflix. This means that I not only get to watch practically any Korean dramas I want, both recent, such as Itaewon Class, and classics such as Winter Sonata, but I also get to overdose on Korean singing shows, Fantastic Duo, Hidden Singer, I Can See Your Voice, and the likes. Then there are the food shows. In recent years, programs that feature people cooking, eating, talking endlessly about food have dominated the Korean media. And most, if not all of these shows are streamed almost instantaneously to TVs, computers, and smartphones all around the world. For example, from the comfort of my couch in upstate New York, I'm able to watch an endless procession of food programming, such as What Are We Eating Today?, hosted by the balladeer Sung Si-kyung, whose song On the Street is atop my go-to Notabang playlist. And Please Take Care of My Refrigerator, in which the home refrigerator of celebrities are literally carted off to a TV studio where Korea's top chefs compete by cooking from its contents. Moreover, graphic scenes of young, beautiful Koreans eating luscious Korean food, televised not just in HD, but I think 7 or 8K by now, have become narrative mainstay of Korean dramas. Just this past year alone, I have personally binge-watched or re-watched several of these shows, including Let's Eat, parts 1, 2, and 3, starring Yoon Do-jun of the idol group Highlight, formerly known as Beast, whose song Fiction is one of the greatest songs ever recorded. Late Night Restaurant, based on the Japanese manga and TV drama Shinya Shokudo. Drinking Solo, about the boozy adventures of a group of teachers and students at a cram school. And I recently finished Walk of Love, featuring, yes, Jang Hyuk, who also starred in what I consider to be among the most underrated Korean dramas in history, Thank You, 고맙습니다, whose storyline revolves around a single mother played by Kang Hyo-jin and her HIV-positive daughter. It is not an exaggeration to say that Korea is currently afflicted with a major case of food obsession. The proliferation of mukbang, or eating broadcasts, in which viewers tune in to watch and interact with other people eating ridiculous amounts of food on live streaming video, is just one manifestation of this obsession. Another manifestation is the omnipresence of the celebrity chef Park Jung-won, who is basically the Korean version of Julia Child, Emerald Lagasse, Bobby Flay, Rachel Ray, KFC, Pizza Hut, and Starbucks all rolled into one. For anyone with Netflix, I invite you to watch Chef Beck in the two-part documentary Korean Pork Belly Rhapsody, which makes a plausible case for samgyeopsal, or pork belly, being regarded as today's national food of Korea. In a nutshell, the documentary argues that samgyeopsal, because it's filling, cheap, simple, fast, tasting, and abundant, was the perfect food for the country as it experienced an economic growth beginning in the early 1970s at a pace faster than perhaps any other country has in the history of the world. Under this criterion, I would also include millions of miles of instant ramen, gazillions gallons of coffee, and endless bottles of soju as fuel that fed Korea's economic rise. Due to the remarkable staying power, if not escalation, of the Korean wave, the current Korean food obsession is now being transmitted around the world, from Vietnam to Indonesia, from Mexico to Saudi Arabia. Servings of Descendant of the Sun and Goblin are accompanied by sides of kimchi and tteokbokki, which is often now covered with gooey cheese, and mouthful of Blackpink and BTS are chased down by shots of beer mixed with soju, also known as somek. The US is no exception, as indicated not only by the success of Nongshim, but also the increasing visibility of the CJ food conglomerate. Not so coincidentally, while Korean American chefs like Roy Choi and David Chang were receiving accolades for their deliciously inventive, if not radically transformative approach to Korean food, the decidedly conservative forces of soft power of gastro diplomacy, headlined by kimchi, were hard at work bringing a more traditional version of Korean food to the US and anywhere else that was willing to open their mouths and wallets. In 2009, under the direct order of President Lee Myung-bak, the Korean government began an ambitious, if not ambiguous, campaign to elevate hanchik to one of the top 5 cuisines of the world. By the year 2017, I don't know if they succeeded, but they succeeded quite a bit, I think. They got almost reached the goal. In real terms, the goal was to increase the number of overseas Korean restaurants from about 10,000 to 40,000, to establish at least 100 high-end hanchik restaurants around the world, and to more than double the export of Korean agricultural and seafood products. The hanchik globalization efforts also entailed a coordinated effort to standardize Korean food, which became an important step in laying down the groundwork of industrial level production and export of Korean food. The government established culinary schools in a number of countries, created a recipe manual that was distributed to overseas Korean restaurants, and registered the standardized recipes of important staples, such as kimchi, gochujang, and doenjang, with the Codex Alimentarius of the United Nations. To ensure the success of the hanchik initiative, in 2010, Kim Yoon-ok, the first lady of Korea at the time, made a series of overseas visits, including taking part in a well-publicized Korean food event in the New York City area with American veterans of the Korean War. Joining the first lady, who made seafood pageant for the veteran, with the Korean-American actress Moon Bloodgood, Chef Jean-Georges Van der Richten, you see him in the background there, and Marja Van der Richten, the wife of Jean-Georges and star of Kimchi Chronicles, a 13-part PBS series about Korean food that aired in 2011. What drew even greater media attention the same year, at least in Korea, was an event in which the First Lady not only handmade kimchi, but hand-fed kimchi to Hatayama Miyuki, the wife of the Japanese Prime Minister Hatayama Yukio. And this is incredible because of the long-standing feud between Japan and Korea. I'm almost at the end, folks. Part 9, get to the other side of the wall. So, how did kimchi end up in tacos? If Donald Trump's wall ever gets built, does that mean we have to take kimchi out of tacos? Or worse yet, deport all tacos south of the wall? Does the Korean taco pretend the culinary apocalypse? Or does it herald the future of borderless, but nonetheless delicious gastronomic amalgamation? The answers to these questions rest first and foremost on understanding the current state of Korean food in America. This means not only assessing the contribution of prominent Korean American chefs and cooks and the influence of the Korean wave, as I try to do here, but also traveling back to more than a century to the earliest days of Korean immigration to see how Americans coped with the pressures of culinary assimilation, adaptation, coercion, and resistance. Most Korean Americans do not eat Korean food because it is suddenly hip to do so. For as long as they have lived in the US, Korean food has been, and it continues to be, just common, regular, everyday fare. Foods that mean, for better or for worse, home, family, community. And it has been this way since the arrival of the first wave of Koreans to Hawaii and the US more than a century ago. What did Koreans in 1930s LA eat when there were no H Marts? What did the scores of Korean women who married American GIs cook for their husbands when they were brought back to live in the American heartland and hinterlands after the war? How did the thousands of Korean adoptees who grew up in white families react when they first tasted kimchi and tteokbokki? How did the 1965 Immigration Act alter the culinary map of the United States? And how have Korean Americans contributed to the redrawing of the new map? To date, neither scholars of Korean American studies or food studies have significantly addressed these questions. It is my hope that future scholars take up these questions and do them justice. Lastly, and perhaps most importantly, in order to understand why there is suddenly kimchi in tacos, we must come to terms with the reality that no matter how tall, powerful, or beautiful it might be, no wall is impenetrable. The very existence of the kimchi taco or the Korean taco is evidence of this. An inherent feature of all walls, borders, and boundaries is their permeability. Things have a way of going around, jumping over, and seeping through barriers, be they natural or man-made. And in today's digitized world, in which nothing is more anachronistic than physical walls, things easily teleport back and forth, no matter how secure the firewall. In the words of Martin Luther King Jr., after visiting the Berlin Wall on September 13, 1964, which is 2 days after I was born, here's what he said: "For here on either side of the wall are God's children, and no man-made barrier can obliterate that fact. Whether it be east or west, men and women search for meaning, hope for fulfillment, yearn for faith in something beyond themselves, and cry desperately for love and community to succor them in this pilgrim journey." If you need more than Reverend King's words to convince you of this, then here's another quote from another prominent American. I'll tell you, to me, the second most important thing, I don't know what the first is, that you do is never, ever give up. Don't give up. Don't allow it to happen. If there's a concrete wall in front of you, go through it, go over it, go around it, but get to the other side of the wall. Who uttered these words, you ask? Why, it was Donald Trump. During a commencement ceremony he gave at Wagner College in Staten Island in May 2004. In order to grasp the true meaning of the Korean taco truck, we must come to terms with the fact that of all the types of borders that can be imagined or erected, the least powerful of them are the ones built on political fear and loathing. Whether we talk about the movement of peoples, ideals, or things, such as delicious and stinky kimchi, walls can never keep a good taco down. Conclusion. In September 2015, Nongshim, which claims to be the #1 noodle and snack manufacturer in Korea, celebrated its 50th anniversary. Founded in 1965 under the name Lotte International Company, the company boasts of having been the first in Korea to invent many processed foods, including instant jajangmyeon in 1970, shrimp crackers in 1971, and a snack containing real potatoes in 1980. Today, Nongshim is best known for producing 3 of Korea's most iconic instant noodle products: Noguri, launched in 1982, Chapagetti, 84, and Shin Ramen, 86. Among these, Shin Ramen is considered the company's flagship product, as it accounts for nearly 1/4 of all instant noodles sold domestically. Having held the top spot in Korea's competitive instant ramen market since 1991, Shin Ramen is now among the most globally recognized brands, outselling my old favorite Sapporo Ichiban by miles, and it is exported to over 100 countries. A halal certified version of the product, first launched in 2011, is exported to 40 countries with large Muslim population. And while China is the top importer of the product, Japan and the US are also among the leaders. Nongshim's corporate presence in the US dates to 2005, when the company built its first US manufacturing facility in Southern California, which is home to the largest Korean community in the country. In addition to more facilities established near Chicago and in New Jersey, the success of Nongshim can be measured by the fact that a 4-pack of Shin Ramen is sold for $3.79 at Wegmans. In GOD's To Mother, Jajangmyeon is characterized as a food of luxury and is put in direct opposition to instant ramen, which is depicted as a food of poverty. 13 years after the song's debut, the girl group Tiara was signed by Nongshim to advertise its flagship product, Shin Ramen, to consumers in Japan, the birthplace of instant ramen. In a series of short commercials aired in Japan, each member of Tiara, who at the time was hugely popular there, were filmed cooking a different recipe using Shin Ramen.
더 끓여줍니다. 끓는 국물에 면을 넣고 그 위에 햄을 넣고 5분간 더 끓여줍니다. 불을 끄기 직전 달걀을 넣고 파와 치즈를 얹어주면 먹는 재미도 가득한 햄치즈 바나나 라면이 완성됩니다.
In these clips, rather than evoking poverty or hardship, as was the case in GOD's To Mother, ramen is presented not only as a food of the young, hip, and beautiful, but also a food that is unapologetically Korean. But just as no relationship between Korea and Japan is without some controversy, whether meaningful or trivial, one particular Tiara member's clip caused a stir among Japanese consumers. After demonstrating the simplest form of method of cooking Shin Ramen, Ji-yeon sits down to sample her dish.
우와, 와 진짜 맛있겠죠? 오, 제가 시식을 해보겠습니다.
As she begins to eat, she uses the lid of the pot as a makeshift dish. While for Koreans, eating ramen and only ramen off the pot lid is commonplace, in Japan, this is apparently frowned upon. Scores of angry commenters began to post on the YouTube video link criticizing Ji-yeon's table manners as barbaric and uncivilized. One angry commenter opined that I find it almost barbaric to use the lid instead of a regular dish. That's just disgusting. Undaunted, another Tiara member, Hyomin, tweeted in response, ramen always tastes better when you eat it off the pot lid. And the lid will, of course, be cleaned with the pot afterward. So, while a lot has changed during my 40-year sleep, the bad blood between Korea and Japan has on many levels remained hot, 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 hot. Okay, thank you.
Thank you so much, Robert. We covered so many things that I don't even know where to begin with the questions. But first of all, thank you so much. I mean, once again, I guess it just shows that a simple thing like an instant ramen can teach us so many things about a country's culture and also its relationship with the others. But since we're in the United States, I wanted to quickly ask you a little bit about this whole idea of sort of ethnic food becoming very popular. And you mentioned sort of the foodie culture and how people who are really interested in food tends to be very interested in a certain type. And there's always that question of authenticity. And a lot of the food that you mentioned, I think a lot of non-Koreans, if they are really interested in food, they tend to look for this, whatever is authentic versus what is just presented to them as Korean food. What is your thoughts on this, the quest for authenticity when it comes to ethnic food?
Actually, my first book, Dubious Gastronomy, was all about the notion of authenticity and the myth of authenticity. I argue that authenticity is a mirage. It is like Ahab's whale, Moby Dick. It's like Waiting for Godot. It's like Bigfoot. It's mythical. We think it exists, but you wait and wait and it never shows up. Authenticity is a marketing ploy. Authenticity is something that you call upon when you feel something you treasure is threatened. Authenticity is, in the United States, a way for ethnic entrepreneurs, restaurant owners, as for instance, to make sure they have customers because the word is so powerful. My mom, who left Korea when she was much younger in the 1970s, when she went back to Korea last year, or maybe a few years ago, for the first time in a long time, she basically said, what is this food here? She thought the contemporary Korean food was inauthentic. Instead, the food that she grew up with and she came with in her sort of spirit to Hawaii in the 70s, that's real Korean food, right? And so she decries the change that happened in Korea and that Korean America is more authentic.
To her.
Right, to her. And I think that's very true. I go to Korea all the time and cheese on tteokbokki, come on, is that authentic? Well, I would say yes, because I reject the entire notion of authenticity. Authenticity is actually very oppressive, right? It is something, once again, used for, in the most positive sense, I think. Once again, to survive in this country. In a negative sense, can be very racist. Because for many non-Asians, for instance, if Asian food seems too modern, they say it's not authentic because they still see China and Korea and Japan as primitive. The real Asia, the real Orient is still primitive. It's still a colony, right? It's still empire, part of the empire. So once these places embrace modernity, post-modernity, then non-natives freak out. Oh my God, they put corn on pizza in Korea. Korea, that is so authentic, right? Koguma or sweet potato on pizza. It is so authentic. Almost every single, well, I would say without exception, foods everywhere that's authentic at one point was not. It was fusion. And over time, it settles into a kind of tradition. And so tradition, yes, we can talk about that. But authenticity, I think that is a useless term.
Then I also wanted to ask you, because you mentioned all these wonderful Korean American chefs who are receiving a lot of accolades and they are becoming popular, and they don't necessarily have to be Korean chefs. I mean, they're American chefs, basically. Right. And then one of the chefs you mentioned, Edward Lee, he wrote a book called Buttermilk Graffiti. And he sort of argues that it's what he cooks is basically American food because he's doing it in America. Do you think there's a difference between, as your mom suggested, there's a difference between the food of diaspora, the Korean American food versus what's going on in Korea right now? And what would be, yeah.
Yeah, I think less and less. I think in 1970, when I came, 1980, 90, even 2000, there was a divide, a schism between culture that was developing in Korea, and of course we mean South Korea, right? And in the United States. And elsewhere you have Korean diaspora. But in today's era, with digital technology, with people going back and forth, with the way we live now, that gap has narrowed. And what is Korean diasporic is, to me, the line is so blurry, it might as well not exist. And so today's presentation that I gave was my attempt, in fact, to try to demonstrate the seamlessness with which we can talk about Korea and Korean America, and it still be about both Korea and America. Because Korea is a product of American intervention. Korea is a product of all these interventions, right? 부대찌개, for example, product of US military, and so many other things. Wheat, all that punchik, all that food that takes wheat, like jajangmyeon, like mandu, like sujebi. Why are people, Koreans, eating that suddenly in great amounts in the 1960s and 70s? Because rice shortage, and because the US dumped excess flour onto the Korean market, right? And so Koreans had to think of new ways to eat, and they took wheat and they made it into Korean food. Meanwhile, in the United States, this country is a product of immigrants, of indigenous people, of legacy of slavery. To only define America as European is racist, right? And so I think the two today has come so close together. It's seamless. Today, this semester, I'm teaching a class on the Korean wave at Binghamton University. My students, I have about 40 of them. Of the 40, maybe 5 are Korean ethnics. Rest are not, right? Most of them are Americans, Japanese American, Chinese American, Indian American, white American, right? They know so much about Korean culture, BTS, so much, today we're watching Itaewon Class together this semester. They know all about all the actors. They know everything much more than me. Why? Because as like toddlers, because they're now 18, 19, 20 years old, 10 years ago, they got deep involved with K-pop, with K-dramas, with K-beauty, and everything else, with Gangnam Style. And so for them, growing up in America was to consume Korean popular culture, just as growing up in Korea in 1960s and 70s was to consume American culture, Japanese culture, you have it, right? So I think increasingly there's a blurring of the categories which are arbitrary.
It will be just fascinating to see what these young people who grew up with Korean culture as part of their own culture, what they think of as they grow up in terms of their relationship to Asians and Asian Americans. That's something I think we can sort of look forward to. And I feel like we can just go on and on, but unfortunately, that's all the time we have right now. So thank you so much, Professor Koo, for your wonderful, wonderful lecture. I hope you'll come back. I envy your students. I mean, a class where you can watch Itaewon Class all together. So it's like a really a wonderful way to spend some time, especially during this COVID era. So be healthy and keep in touch. And special thanks to Peter, our IT director, for making this live webcast a possibility, and to our intern Gia for getting all the questions and doing social media postings. And of course, our thanks to you, our viewers and members. We hope you'll join us again. Check out what's coming up on our website, koreasociety.org, or subscribe to our YouTube channel. And thank you and good night.
Good night, everyone. And my apologies for reading so fast. I wanted to cover everything. Thank you.